everyone, welcome to this very first session of complex trauma training. Today's session is on complex trauma fundamentals. My name is Stephanie Helfer. I'm a senior clinical psychologist, and the sessions, this first one, as well as the other ones that I'll be uploading, are aimed to help us better understand complex trauma, to help us better understand a cohort of kids that a lot of us are actually quite frightened, might we say, of working with, because these behaviors can be very scary. So a lot of them can be young people that are affected by relational trauma, young people who might be in out-of-home care, who present as incredibly dysregulated, who are very difficult to engage, who are very rejecting, very much help rejecting, very aggressive, and also who may have involvement with juvenile justice, etc. There are frequent emergency department presenters. They are sometimes even frequently admitted to our inpatient units, and they are the really complex kids that will have so many agencies involved, and we all really struggle.
You're not fucking keeping me safe.
That crowbar gonna be talking.
Don't want to talk to you. Cat, timber.
How is Lee safe on the streets at 3 o'clock in the morning, getting beat up and left in the gutter? How safe is he when he's breaking and entering with people, or he's sleeping on a roof, or he's found in a room with males that might have different thoughts of life?
Around it in jail, you get everything you want. You just ask the officers, they go get it for you. Want Macca's, you tell them to go get Macca's. KFC, you got air conditioners every day, like 24/7, they never go off.
Man, he's got serious problems.
Most of the things that's coming out of your mouth is bullshit. I could be here for another 4 months.
He was just yelling and screaming and crying. Mum doesn't want me anymore. I'm going to go live in a foster home.
Oh, fuck, it hurts. I'm sitting up here and relaxing, thinking about something that I can't forget.
I've been working with these kids for a really long time, and I still struggle. I don't know what to do with them a lot of the time. And I think we all need to come together and just understand that this is really hard work. This is not easy work. It's really hard work at an emotional level. It's really hard work at an academic level, because there's not a lot of answers out there. So what I want to do is contribute to this work, contribute and try to support the people that are really trying to figure out how to make an impact and a difference in these young people's life. So today is the very, very first session. It's about understanding how it is that these early experiences have contributed to how these young people present, and what it is about these very early attachment experiences, really how that has affected the developing brain. So let's begin. Among the many relationships that we form in our lifetime, the mother and child relationship is the most important. Babies are born with attachment circuits in the brain that make attachment to the carer possible. It starts prenatally and continues through most of early life. So about the first 1,000 days, and you're going to hear this a lot out there, the child's first 1,000 days, the infant's first 1,000 days, the most important. And what we know about this 1,000 days, which is really up until 2.5 to 3 years, is that this period of development, of brain development, is entirely dedicated to the development of emotion regulation, to the development of relationships, right? This is so important. So the first 3 years of our lives, 2.5, 3 years of our life, is entirely dedicated to helping us develop an ability to regulate affect. This is important for our survival. And this is important for us to know, because this is probably the greatest difficulty that a lot of our young people who have experienced complex trauma lack, right? And it's probably what's at the core of a lot of the difficult behaviors, the challenging behaviors, the aggression, the difficulty in engaging, responding to therapy. And this is all going to make sense, right? But But let's find out how is it, what's happening in those first 3 years, and how do we know this? Well, actually, we know this through neuroimaging studies that have shown that the right side of the brain during that period of time in an infant is much larger in volume, and it also has a lot more blood flow to it than it does to the left hemisphere. It's so interesting. And it is the right hemisphere, right, that has to do with emotion regulation, that has to do with relationships, implicit memory. The left with skills such as language and reasoning and cognitive skills. We see a lot of that then emerging at around 2.5 and 3 years. And that's when we see a shift in the brain from right to left. And actually the brain develops like that. So the trajectory of brain development is right, left, right, left. So in the first 3 years of life, right, we've got the primary part of the brain that is developing, that is active, is that right side of the brain. Now, this is really important. It's important because if a young person, if an infant is experiencing complex trauma, relational trauma in that very early period, then we know that the trauma is taking its toll in this part of the brain, right? This is well before that declarative part is developing, that left side is developing. So this is important when it comes to interventions, and something that we have to keep in mind. Okay, so there seem to be 2 main roles for attachment. And the first is, of course, ensuring that the infant stays close to the caregiver for safety. That makes sense. But arguably, the most important function of the human attachment system is to generate a self-regulating system within the child, so that this attachment relationship, for good or bad, programs the lifelong structure and function of the brain, which underpins emotion regulation. So over the years, and with neuroscience, attachment theory has greatly evolved from what used to be a theory about relationships between caregivers and their infants into a theory of emotion regulation, into a theory of how relationships affect brain development. This is amazing. And a lot of things that we have seen over the years are now going to make sense with what we now know about neuroscience. So how does this actually happen? I'm going to use the word, well, it's not a word, I'm going to use the phrase external co-regulation, okay? And what that means is how one person, through her behavior, is able to regulate the internal arousal of another. So in an infant-mother relationship, this happens through a mother's, response to her infant in an attempt to try to contain the arousal. So when an infant is born, when an infant is very little, and he experiences distress because he's hungry, so that nervous system is experiencing a lot of arousal, a lot of distress, and the mother, that who is sensitive and responsive to that infant's needs, is able to sense that the infant is becoming dysregulated, and then she is able to respond appropriately by feeding, in this particular instant, the infant. And through that behavior, that infant's dysregulation is contained, that infant's level of distress, that arousal that he's experiencing in distress, is contained. So it's contentment. Right? And so this is an example of how it is that through her behavior, she's externally co-regulating that infant's affect. Because when babies are born, they don't know how to regulate affect. Their little nervous systems and their little brains, it's not developed enough. It's not mature enough. None of us were born with this ability to regulate affect. It is something that we have learned. We have developed this skill. The areas in our brain have matured over time to help us master this skill or become more competent. Some of us still haven't mastered it. But, it's through these experiences that take that infant from this positive then to negative and then back to positive affect that really help that nervous system become adaptable and flexible during times of stress, right? And this is how attachment then has an impact, right, on the areas in the brain that underpin emotion regulation, how it has an impact on that little infant's nervous system, because these areas in the brain, this little nervous system, it matures, but it is experience dependent. And through attachment that is positive, where the carer is able to then respond in a positive way, is able to respond in a nurturing way, in a way that is meeting that infant's needs, then what she's actually doing through her behavior is externally regulating that affect of that infant. Now, this is really important. This is key, because a lot of our young people that haven't had this experience, that haven't had this experience at regulating affect from very early on, still need that external co-regulation of affect. And in fact, we all do it through relationship. So when you're talking to a friend, you're talking to a child, or a family member, someone close to you, anyone really, and you start noticing that they're starting to feel uncomfortable, or you start noticing that they start talking to you about something that's quite hard and they're starting to get sad, upset, we automatically do something to regulate that affect in the other person. So we are engaging in that dynamic. We are externally co-regulating that affect by validating how they feel, by hugging them, by changing the subject, by joking. And a lot of people ask me, so how do you do this in session? So, when we're in session and the child is becoming dysregulated, when they're talking about something, you notice it because the leg starts to shake, or because they're starting to talk about something and becoming, too overwhelmed by it. And as a therapist, or just as someone, a person that is talking to them, you sort of start to notice the signs that this is becoming overwhelming, right? And you want to be able to contain it. So you can call it out and say, hey, I can see that leg shaking. I think this is really, really hard for us to talk about right now. I think we're going to leave it there. I think that's what we're going to do. Yeah, I think so. There are many ways in which we engage in the external co-regulation of affect. And it really does require us to be attuned to signs that the other person's becoming a little bit dysregulated, that their arousal is increasing. But, we do this within relationships. Relationships are really important. So it's all about modern attachment theory. Modern attachment theory describes how social emotional attachment experiences shape the developing brain, specifically the early developing social emotional right brain. So that we now have, at this point in time, attachment theory as a coherent theory of development that is grounded in both psychological science and neuroscience, and thereby is on a much firmer ground than it used to be. Have a look at this. This is one of the books that I refer to a lot, and it's called Affect Regulation and the Origin of the Self by Alan Shaw. If you're interested in reading a lot of what we're going to discuss today and talk about today, a lot of that evidence, I would definitely recommend that book. And so this is it. It's not a thin, skinny book, but if you like to read, some other books that are also really, really interesting for those who want to learn a little bit more, because this is going to be a short training session, is this one. So Affect Regulation and the Repair of the Self. And these two books go together. So Affect Dysregulation and Disorders of the Self. Again, both by Alan Shaw. Really good books. As well as Affect Regulation, Mentalization and the Development of the Self. And this one's by multiple authors. Right there. Okay, that was the boring bit. Let's get down to the fun bit. Have a look at this beautiful, beautiful little picture, everybody. We have in this picture a mother and an infant, little 3-month-old infant, engaged in a process called attunement. So attunement is a deep, genuine and significant connection between two humans. You can have attunement between a mother and an infant, attunement between a patient and a therapist, a brother and a sister, two human beings, this attunement. And what you're seeing here, right here, this beautiful little attunement between this mother and this infant is one of the most powerful of all forces in all of nature. And we don't think about it as a force of nature in the same way that physicists think of laws, but I'm telling you, this is a law. And what I also want to say to you is that it takes so much to derail this force, this drive that this mother has for her infant. So when we see in a lot of our practice, that there's this disconnect between this mother and this adolescent, or this mother and this child, or this father and this child, sometimes we're very quick to judge, and it's awful. A lot of the things that we see happen is awful, but just remember, this is a law. So what we're seeing, it takes a lot to derail for it to become that. So a lot of the time, those parents were once the kids that are the subject of this training session. And sometimes what they give is the best that they can give, but it is limited because of what they too have been through. This is not natural, but there is a reason why it's the way that it is. And I think it's really important to remember that. And I have to say, personally, when I first started working, this was very hard. And I was constantly, I really struggled to see beyond taking that child's view. And it's not to justify that it's okay to do a lot of the things that these, people do to their children. But it was when these kids that I had protected for years, that I had given a voice for years, who then became parents and did things that, I then had to shift position and protect their children from them. And that was really hard, but it was an eye-opener. An eye-opener. And being a parent, we know, is so hard. And so many of these kids, all they want is to be loved. And so many just want to get pregnant. So many just want to have a child because they think that this is going to be the way that they can get that need that they've been wanting to get fulfilled their entire lives from the day they were born. If I have a child, that's going to be unconditional love. And those of you who have children, you know what that's like. That's like a test for breaking point, I still don't get any sleep. I thought I was a rational person until I had children. They push you to your limit. They teach you they teach you to become even more regulated. It's really, really tough. So a lot of this, what we see between parents and infants, or even, parents and the adolescent young people, when there's just that disconnect, there's probably a lot going on there for that parent as well. And there's definitely limited capacity. So let's go back to this picture. This mother and this baby are in a process called attunement. His little eyes and her eyes are locked and they're dancing together. And in this child's brain, there are 1,000 new connections being formed per second. 1,000. This child is learning to read facial expressions. He is learning about the world. This is his first exposure to reading and understanding emotions and understanding expressions, facial expressions in others. Do you know that a lot of our kids can't do that? So, when the baby cries, the baby's upset, an infant is crying and upset, what's the first thing that we do? We reach out to that infant to pick him up and we mimic that sad face. We mirror the sad face. We have our own sad. So the baby's crying. We do the same thing. And we pick the baby up, and what does the baby see? Our sad face. Right? So we are exposing and we are teaching these little babies about emotions and emotional expressions from the moment that they are born. This is a socialization of emotions, and it's happening within that carer-child relationship, within that personal experience, interpersonal experience. So when we are mimicking and mirroring that face to that infant, to that baby, this is his first link to first seeing your face, what his face looks like when he's feeling this way, and then making that link between his arousal and that facial expression. You know, so many of the young people that are the subject of this training session today are very poor at identifying emotions in others and recognizing emotional expressions. That is a given fact. Research has shown that they really do lack that. But there's one thing that they're actually really good at, sadly actually, and that is identifying anger in others. If anything, they are more likely to see and identify neutral looking faces as angry. And that is because to survive, the brains have been primed to identify the most minor sign of anger in another person to ensure the survival. So we see what the research is showing is that they're able to recognize angry faces. They fail at recognizing other emotions. So this little infant is learning about the world. He is learning that the world is responsive. He is learning that he can be an object of delight, that he can delight others. He's learning that, he's so worthy. But he could also be learning that the world is not responsive, that he's unworthy, that he's not a delight. What are the experiences that he's having? And from this very early age, what is he learning about himself, the world, and others? So this interaction, what we're seeing here, this attunement is critical. It's so critical for human development. And without it, you're impaired in so many ways. And so many of the young people who are have been removed from the homes due to relational trauma, abuse, neglect, they are impaired in these ways. Actually, a lot of the young people who are in detention centers, in juvenile detention centers, are impaired in these ways. This is critical stuff. These interactions are so important. And what we also see is that the mother is changing as well. She's also in an altered state. Oxytocin is being secreted. They're in a reciprocal interaction state. This is the foundation of empathy. This child is learning with his eyes, and we see in this other slide, he's learning with his hands. His brain is forming a concept of what other humans are like, of what the world is like, with what he can see, with what he can touch with his hands, with what he can touch with his little feet. In like this little picture here, we can see how his little feet are touching his mum. I don't know if you can see that clearly. So infants don't use verbal language. They connect with those who intuitively understand nonverbal communication. Yeah, we all know that, right? Babies don't talk. But this is something you might not know, and this is again so critical when it comes to a lot of these kids, because this is how we communicate with a lot of adolescents and children with complex trauma, and anyone really in a therapeutic relationship. So how a mother in that infant mother carer dynamic knows that her infant is becoming dysregulated is through her body. That infant doesn't understand words, nor does he have words to use to communicate to his mother about how he's feeling. But she knows through her body, and this is what we now know, that a mother or a carer, and even us, I think, when we are attuned to an infant or somebody else, we'll know through our body how they are feeling, because our nervous system begins to replicate the autonomic rhythms of that infant's nervous system, so that a mother feels with her body how her infant is feeling, and she is therefore able to respond. So there's a saying, one of my favorite ones is, the most misleading form of communication is language, or language is the most missing important, something along those lines. You get the idea. And this is so true. This is so true because, you know, those instances where you go into session or you go in with even someone that you know, a friend or a family, yeah, I'm okay, everything's okay, but you know that it's not. You're just feeling it's not. So you are attuning to that person, and your nervous system is replicating the autonomic rhythms, and so your body is telling you. So this is something that we're going to talk about in today's training and other training as well, because this is something really important in learning to communicate with young people. Is not so much listening to the words, but listening beneath the words. This is really important. Listening beneath the words. There is so much that is shared from human to human beneath words, that is a side of the verbal narrative. That is when, and I refer to this as you got to listen with your body. So this is really interesting. This is really interesting stuff. And have a look at this. You've got a father and a little infant, you know, engaging in what Alan Shaw refers to as right brain to right brain communication. And what we know from the research is that mothers play a really big role in an infant's development of regulation of a lot of affect, most affect, but it is anger where the male caregiver plays a significant role from second year onwards through rough play. That's really interesting. And this many of you have seen me and my training sessions before. I probably present this picture all the time because I love the fact that it just shows how brains respond to relationships. And here we have a mother and infant bond at the level of its most basic neuroanatomy. We see this vulnerable, immature little brain that is being held by a more robust, mature brain. The baby is experiencing the warmth and the care of his mother, and it's actually responding. There are chemicals being released as a result of that. Oxytocin is being triggered in this baby's brain. Stress hormones are dropping in this baby's brain. Dopamine is being promoted as a result of this loving contact. And this is all as a result of experiencing the warmth and the care of his mother. So I just want to highlight how it is that in every moment-to-moment interaction between an infant and his caregiver, that brain is changing. There are chemicals impacting the way in which that brain is developing, and it continues. It means that these, you know, relationship or relational interactions, these emotional interactions, continue to have an impact on the developing brain. Brains develop within relationships. Okay, and what's important when it comes to complex trauma is that brains heal within relationships. Brains heal within relationships. Most importantly for complex trauma is that you don't need to be a therapist to be part of the healing process. You just need to be a good human being who can develop a positive and nurturing relationship, you know, with these young people. And that in itself can be so healing. You don't need to be a therapist. Don't need to be a doctor. You just need to be human. The infant's exposure to the human world consists simply of whatever his mother actually does with her face, voice, body, hands. The ongoing flow of her acts provides for the infant his emerging experience with the stuff of human communication and relatedness. The choreography of maternal behaviors is the raw material from the outside world with which the infant begins to construct his knowledge and experience of all things human. And why I think this is important It's because I want us all to understand that the world that we come from is very different to the world that they come from. And sometimes when these two worlds meet, they just don't see eye to eye. And we need to ask ourselves, if we want to understand these young people and understand a little bit about the world that has shaped who they are today, is ask yourself, what does that behavior suggest about the world that they come from? And how is that different, to the world that I know? How do I communicate to that person in a way that reflects understanding, compassion, and empathy about the experiences that shape who they are today? What does that mean? It means, an example, because these kids present incredibly aggressive, incredibly dysregulated, very rude, a lot of them, we can sometimes, because we don't know that history, we don't know all the things that have happened to them, and we often label these as, delinquents and so. How it is that a behavior or a way in which they present themselves, what is that telling us about the world that they come from, and how that makes a difference in the way that we interact with them. And a really good one was, someone said to me once that they were playing and having a good time with this young person. It was fine, it was great, playing basketball in this particular agency unit, and then some strangers walked in to see another young person that was in the unit, and this girl that they were engaging with, within a second, started flipping tables, swearing, and just very aggressive. Didn't hurt anybody, it was just like that. And she was taken back and thought, what's going on? Like, do you just change like that? What's going on? And when she said that to me, I said, wow, what that tells me, or what I would, given the context, given that this girl has a lot of complex trauma, and we've got some strangers coming into that space that she felt safe, I thought, I wonder if over time, through her experiences, she's had to learn that if she doesn't respond like that, then you don't survive. So whenever you see a threat, so in her life, maybe she's had to respond so quickly within a second in order to survive. What is it about a young person's behavior that tells us about the world when they're telling us, or when they don't talk to adults but they only talk to the young people? What does that tell us about what they think about adults? Are they trusting? Are they not trusting? A lot of the behaviors and a lot of their interpretation of threat, a lot of their interpretation of what the world is like, depends on what their early interactions have been, what their life experiences have been, and that world is very different to ours. A young person that really struggles to sleep and is hypervigilant to a light switch being turned off, it's very telling of the level of hypervigilance they've had to endure in order to survive. It's all about survival. And the things that the brain is going to do to keep you alive, it's just amazing. When we are born with our survival brain, primarily working, because as humans, as animals, that is our priority, to survive. Let's move on. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So attachment, therefore, as we think of it now, is about this interactive regulation of emotion, about how insecure attachments, not insecure, how insecure, I'm confusing everyone, how in a secure attachment, that's better, how in a secure attachment, it is that the caregiver is able to respond in ways by responding and fulfilling that infant's needs that in effect then contain the level of arousal, because that little infant is unable to contain that. Little nervous system and areas in the brain that underpin that affect regulation have not developed with the ability to do that just yet. So why is emotion regulation so important? You know, emotion regulation underpins mental health, anxiety, depression. Psychology is really about the regulation of emotions, however these may manifest. You know, emotion regulation or self-regulation refers to our ability to tolerate or to contain the physiological arousal within a tolerable range. So that if we can keep it within a manageable range where it's not too high, it's not too low, then we are self-regulating. If it becomes overwhelming and difficult to contain, then we can say we are having difficulty with affect regulation. And affect regulation or dysregulation can present in many ways. So, for example, for us, we need emotion regulation in everyday life. We have everyday stresses presenting to us. You know, when we're running late, some of us really struggle with being late. I don't like being late. Traffic. You know, I don't know how many of you like to sit in traffic, and how many of you really do lose it when you're in traffic. You need to regulate. We need emotion regulation for that. But we need it for major stresses in life. We need it for when we lose people that we love. That's incredibly painful stuff. That's really, really painful stuff. That's emotions that you really need to regulate. We need it for, you know, just everyday struggles when you've got a stressful job. When you're looking and watching people in your life that you love suffer. You know, you've got sick people, sick children, very sick children in your life. We all need to learn to regulate, because we all have traumas that are thrown at us in life. But think about these kids, like our stresses sometimes don't even compare to the stresses that these kids are experiencing. So a lot of them are going through multiple placements. So they're going from home to home to home, experiencing rejection from different carers because they're finding it very difficult to, you know, manage them in their homes. And some of them, and most of them, the ones that I see are in residential care because they've exhausted the foster care system. So they've got shift workers coming, you know, different people coming to look after them all the time. You know, they have to share a house with other young people who are also very traumatized, who can be very violent, who can be very scary, who have sexualized behaviors that can be quite threatening and scary as well. But we have also young people who have been removed from their parents, but the siblings are still at home. Or young people, you know, whose parents are really unwell, affected, and they don't know, by drugs or substances, and they don't know. They worry about their health. They worry about their parents and family members being homeless. You know, there's a lot of stresses of these young people that really do exceed the severity of the everyday stresses, because these are everyday stresses for them. These aren't just one-off life events. This is ongoing for them. Every day is a new day of just multiple big stresses for them. So not only do they have bigger stresses than most of us do because of the nature of the life that they're living, but also they have very limited capacity, and they're younger. So, you know, young people they're still developing this capacity to regulate. The older that we are, the more experienced we are with, you know, life and developing, and our brains have matured. But these young kids, they don't even have the basics. You know, they've not had those early experiences within a positive and secure attachment, or most of them anyway, relationship that have helped them develop their ability to regulate affect. So emotion regulation is important. It's important for everyday life. It's important for helping us survive through major traumas in our lives. But it's also something that underpins a lot of mental health. Let's learn a little bit more about the brain. All of us have this 1.3, 1.4 kilogram piece of meat sitting on our cranium. And in a newborn and a young toddler, there are 150 billion nerve cells in this organ, in the brain. And of those 150 billion brain cells, each of those 150 billion brain cells can make anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 connections with the other cells in the brain, which means that the potential connections in a child's brain is of the same order of magnitude as the number of atoms in the known galaxies in the entire universe. So that makes each child's brain and your brain the most complex thing by far. Your brain and your mind by far are the most complex things that exist. And this is relevant because brain connections form or do not form based on experience or lack of experience. And there is a direct correlation between what a child experiences or does not experience and what the brain actually looks like. Let's talk about the different parts of the brain. But this is going to be very simplified for the purposes of today, and also because I actually don't know much more about it. It's just what we need. We're only going to talk about what we need to know about. All right, so we've got our thinking brain, what we call our thinking brain, our neocortex, which is your mind, our reason. It is specific to humans. All our emotions, the extraordinary range of emotions we feel, we share with other animals, that all happens in our limbic part of the brain, which is the emotion part. And it is much older than the thinking brain. But what I want to focus on today is the reptilian brain, the animal brain. Why? Because this is the part that is activated when the brain is traumatized. So we need to, if we're going to communicate with young people with complex trauma, this is a part of the brain that we need to learn to talk to, because we all right now, I'm hoping, have our thinking brains, which is like our learning brains, on. But a lot of these young people have this animal brain, is the part of, as the main active part of the brain that's activated because the brain is traumatized. So sometimes when the thinking brain, is trying to communicate with a child who has experienced complex trauma, we try to do so at the same level. So we're trying to connect with the thinking brain when that's actually not activated, and what we're actually doing is we're agitating the animal brain by trying to demand thinking brain behavior from a brain that is activated at the animal brain level. Let's learn a little bit more about this animal brain and the language that it uses and how we can best communicate, because this, I have to say, is probably where we lose a lot of our young people. We begin to demand thinking brain behavior from a traumatized brain that is functioning at a survival brain level. And this is where we lose engagement. I've done it before. I've learned the hard way. So at birth, all we have is this most primitive part of the brain, the animal brain, the reptilian brain, which is very hardwired. The oldest part of our brain, we share it with every living creature on earth. It is very old. It is hardwired for our survival. So this part of the brain is all about arousal. Self-regulation is the ability to modulate arousal. The development of self-regulation starts at conception with the onset of the development of the brainstem. The brainstem speaks a very particular kind of language. It is the language of sensation. This part of the brain does not understand words. This is the brain that we're born with, and its function is arousal. Little babies experience distress or contentment, dirty nappy, arousal, distress, being fed, contentment. That's what babies experience, just these two levels of arousal. The newborn baby with mainly a brainstem speaks only the language of sensations and modulates arousal and cares only about survival. So if you want to communicate with a baby, it has to be through our senses, and this is the same. This is the same for a child or a young person or even an adult who is primarily functioning at this survival brain level, at the brainstem level. We need to communicate with our senses. That part of the brain does not understand words. That is the thinking brain. That part of the brain understands sensations. So it understands facial expressions. It understands tone of your voice. It understands the soft touch, the rocking, cooing. Okay, that's all ways in which we communicate with the animal brain. This is affecting the arousal level of that baby. Are we causing the distress or the contentment? And it is the same with the brain that is affected by trauma. Are we causing the distress or the contentment? These interactions affect the ability to self-regulate. Soothing is critical. How we respond to an infant will determine their ability to self-regulate. So if we respond with sensations in a positive way, soothing with sensations, then self-regulation comes on board in a good way. The baby is not left in distress. It is soothed into contentment. Carers teach regulation by helping my baby soothe himself from negative to positive affect before that negative arousal becomes overwhelming for its little fragile nervous system. These interactions, like I said before, really do shape the nervous system into being flexible, into being adaptable during times of stress. If the child is left in distress, that nervous system does not learn how to self-regulate. Okay, so what do we know about this nervous system? Studies of the nervous system suggest that the development is experience dependent and that it contains critical periods. Especially in the early caregiver-child interactions, the caregiver senses and modulates the infant's physiological and psychobiological states. The caregivers regulating then functions in that moment, not just to modulate that infant's internal state, but through these interactions, that caregiver is shaping the infant's capacity for self-organization. So not only are we responding to that infant and changing and modulating the affect in that moment, but over time and time again, we're setting that infant up. We're setting that little person up for long-term self-organization. So what happens if the child experiences daily and frequent stressful states that this little baby is just incapable of regulating on his own independently? You know, in cases of abuse and neglect, for example, the child is suffering from neglect. What's the result? Well, the result is not only an insecure attachment pattern, but we're also actually going to see a chaotic disorder of the nervous system. We're going to see very, very chaotic, disrupted nervous system. So what we really have here is this cohort of kids who have an inability to regulate the physiological basis for prosocial behavior. Does that make sense? So we've got a lot of these kids, right, who have these tremendously chaotic nervous systems, have had no experience, or very limited experience, at regulating increasing levels of arousal, right? And so, and this is what we need. So you've all been very angry at some point and really just had to regulate yourselves from saying things that we know we're going to regret, from punching someone in the face maybe because they've really, really hurt you and, you know, just wanted to go for that eye. We've all had, we have developed some sort of capacity to regulate our behavior so that we engage in prosocial behavior. We're not assaulting, we're not abusive. And so these young people actually, with these little chaotic nervous systems, have an inability to regulate the physiological basis for prosocial behavior. They really struggle. In that moment, they really struggle because they are limited with their ability to regulate the physiology. Not just a choice, but really limited in the ability to regulate the physiology associated with prosocial behavior. A child learns emotion regulation through interactions that take him from a positive to a negative, back to positive affect, with the help of the caregivers, of the carers, who enable the child to, or help the child to regulate the emotion into, positive affect before the negative affect becomes overwhelming. And in this way, the nervous system is shaped, as I said before, into being flexible and adaptable when managing stressful experiences. And we are not born with this ability. We are not born with the ability to regulate emotional reactions. If caregivers are not able to support infants when they disintegrate, the infant does not learn to regulate affect. It can be, and this is very, very anxiety provoking for a child. We know now that babies will communicate strong positive and strong negative emotions so that their carers, their mothers in particular, can either upregulate or downregulate. The little brains, the little nervous systems are too immature to do this on their own. They need an external regulator, right? And what we want, and the aim of this, remember, this takes 3 years. The first 3 years of life are dedicated to this development of emotion regulation, and we begin to see signs of self-regulation throughout the second year of life. And often by the third year in particular, we start to see little boys, little girls start to use language, because they've now developed language as ways to regulate their own affect. I remember, my little one, when he was around 3 and he used to fall, I could hear him sometimes say, it's okay, which is what I would normally say to him, when he would fall or hurt himself. And I all of a sudden started hearing him saying it to himself, and it was just a reminder of how he is slowly developing this, or internalizing a way to regulate affect in a given situation. So the attachment relationship shapes the ability of the baby to communicate, but not just with the mother, but ultimately with other human beings. And this is what we mean by this right brain to right brain communication between two human beings. We used to think that babies didn't begin social interactions until about the second year, when they had language, but that's not true. The very first interactions begin from birth, in that baby's attempt to communicate his physiological states to the caregiver, and he does so through his cry. We now know that mothers are attuned with their infants only about 30% of the time in the first 2, 3, 4 months. 30% of the time. That means 70% of the time we're getting it wrong. And so this idea that the mother is always attuned and never stresses the baby is actually a fantasy. And that's okay, because what's important is, yes, being attuned is important, but most importantly, it's about picking up the cues that the baby is becoming further and further dysregulated, and that the mother or the carer is able to respond by altering her or his behavior and repairing that initial misattunement, to repair the rupture. That's so important. That is key, because the ability to repair ruptures allows for the tolerance of negative affect. And it's almost as though this is nature's way of, ensuring that there is that increase ability to that exposure to tolerate negative affect, and the mothers need to be sensitive. Mothers continue to look for ways in which they can contain that affect. Sometimes we don't know what's wrong with the baby, but this whole idea of repair, right, it's so important in therapy. It's so important with these kids that we see with complex trauma, because what we also know about trust is that it is not embedded. It doesn't come from positive experiences. That is not what, develops trust. What develops trust is our ability to repair misattunements, so that when an infant in that mother-child dynamic, in that mother-child interaction, those experiences, is left in a state where the negative affect is arising and there's a misattunement in that the mother can't figure out or has caused the distress or doesn't know how to contain that affect, as she continues to look for that, the infant then learns that even though that negative affect is rising, mother is able to then come in and help contain that affect. We now know that trust is not embedded into a child through positive experiences. We go through ruptures, and then there's the repair. So that means that in our type of work, there's going to be many opportunities to repair. And the more that we repair, the more that these young people, these adolescents, are going to be able or allow themselves to feel these deeper affects, to go into this dark place of their trauma that they couldn't tolerate before, that they couldn't experience before, because they trust that you will be able to repair. This is so important therapeutically, right? It's not about the trust is not embedded or results from positive experiences. But particularly for these young people, it's about knowing that you can get them out of that really dark place if they ever trust you enough to let themselves fall in there. They know that you'll be able to get them back out of it. And this is when children, young people will start talking about the trauma. When there's enough trust, there's been enough repair for them to know that they can make themselves vulnerable. Remember, the dysregulation, the trauma, the stress, that's overwhelming for them, right? It's overwhelming, and they find many ways in which they regulate themselves out of that. So for them to trust that you can get them out, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time, but that's what repair is all about. And so some people, get it wrong. They get it wrong in therapy. And that's okay. We all get it wrong. Sometimes we think we're in the right path, or we push for them to talk a little bit more than they're ready for, and we make mistakes, and we realize we make mistakes, and then we own them. And what we're actually doing is we're repairing. Or they push you away, and then we repair the relationship. These kids will reject you all the time. They will try to not engage with you, or they will test you all the time, because that's what relationships have been like for them. It is very unlikely that someone will stick around long enough. So there will be many, many opportunities for us to repair misattunements, or for us, to repair moments in our relationship. And the more we repair, the more that trust develops. And this is important. Brain development is not just genetically encoded, it needs social experiences. From birth, the mother is affecting more than just the behaviors. She is affecting the genes themselves and affecting how they are being expressed, especially the genes that are encoding the synapses in the brain. And these happen within the mother-child attachment experiences. Events early on in development shape the origin of the self. Early experiences, especially experiences that are emotionally and affectively charged. So this type of emotion emotionally charged experiences with other humans induce and organize the patterns of structural growth in a child's brain. The most important aspect of the environment in influencing brain development is the relationship the infant has with his or her caregivers. These early social emotional events are imprinted into the biological structures that are maturing during the early brain growth spurt and therefore have enduring effects. This stupendous growth rate in the first year is reflected in the increase of brain weight from 400 grams at birth to 1,000 grams at 12 months. The environment is powerfully influencing the development of the brain. So we're born with the animal brain, the brain stem, which speaks only the language of sensations. And very soon after birth, the feeling brain develops. And by about 3 months, babies now feel a range of emotions, not just distress and contentment, but anger, joy, and other emotions. The brain develops in response to the environment, in response to interactions that it is having with people in the environment. So that if we respond to babies in helpful ways, we'll get a healthy development of self-regulation. If we're not responding to them in healthy ways and we're leaving these little infants in a distressed state for too long, that starts to impair the development of self-regulation. So after several months, then we have the neocortex that's beginning to develop, and that's our thinking brain, right? So the neocortex is the whole outside of the brain that protects the inner parts, the feeling brain, the reptilian brain, and so this whole front part and all around the sides, that's our thinking, that's our neocortex portion. And this is what we have that makes us different from other species. It gives us our reason, our ability to control our impulses, our thoughtfulness, ability to consider consequences and plan ahead. Most qualities that are important to school functioning are underlined by the neocortex. And these qualities are what are needed for conventional therapies like CBT. So the brain develops in a hierarchy so that a healthy development of the neocortex depends on a healthy development of the emotional brain. And this is developed in a healthy way if the brainstem develops in a healthy way. So the brain develops in a hierarchy. And so I really want to talk to you now about attachment and complex trauma and differentiating between catastrophe trauma and complex trauma, because I think there is some confusion and sometimes we group catastrophic trauma with complex trauma. And the difference needs to be made because the interventions are different and it's also affecting different parts of the brain. So let's talk about cases where children do not have access to a caregiver who can emotionally resonate, who can regulate their affect. The attachment relationship is not just about the psychology, it's about wiring the brain. Trauma that comes from the relationship, a relationship that is meant to reflect safety, a relationship that is meant to reflect protection and not from physical environment, is what we would refer to as complex trauma. So it is where the source of the dysregulation is that relationship. It is where the major source of the dysregulation is coming from that attachment relationship. It's coming from the haven of protection. This is very different to trauma that is external, that is environmental, because it's not coming from the haven of protection. It's not relational trauma, and this is why it's also enduring trauma, because that relationship is ongoing. That's happening on a daily basis because that relationship is not ending. So it's coming from a place that is supposed to represent safety. It is coming from the haven of protection. It is coming from a relationship that is enduring. And so this is complex trauma. It affects the brain in a way that is different to single catastrophe trauma that is not relational in nature. Even if it's multiple catastrophe trauma that is not relational in nature. So it is really where the primary caregiver is now the source of massive dysregulation. And not only that, but what if that primary caregiver is also not the source of repair? Because remember, we said it's not just about attunement all the time. The mother makes many mistakes, and key is her ability to repair, especially negative affects. When trauma happens during this critical time, these first 3 years of life, the first 1,000 days, all of the experiences during this time, remember we said, are stored in the right hemisphere. Right? This is way before that left side begins its maturation process, which is about 2.5 years onwards. So that's important. Let's talk about this right and left hemisphere. These traumatic experiences are stored if they're happening early on and if they're relational. Stored not in explicit declarative memory, which is left hemisphere, but in implicit procedural memory. That's where the psychopathology is taking its toll. Ultimately then, what the research in neuroscience is suggesting is that's what the treatment must address, which means that we need to use something other than insight models. Maybe we need to use something other than shifting cognitions. Remember, that's very left hemisphere. And focusing on relationships, which can be really very healing. The left hemisphere is dominant for language. The right hemisphere is dominant for processing emotions. The right is dominant for the processing of affect regulation, for processing information that is coming from the body, for nonverbal communication. So ultimately, really, the right hemisphere is going through this growth spurt early in development, or the first 2.5 to 3 years. And what we know about this trajectory of hemisphere development is that it shifts to the left, and then it goes to the right, and then the left, and then right and left. And so for the rest of the lifespan, things are moving along in time, but the initial trajectory of the right brain was set up in that initial attachment relationship. And that's critical because the right brain has more connections into the body, into the autonomic nervous system, and the stress regulating axis in our bodies. So our ability to modulate arousal, to regulate affect, to deal with stress is directly impacted by early caregiver-child relationships. In human infancy, right brain functions are dominant and need to be allowed to fully mature. Throughout life, the right and not the left brain is centrally involved in critical survival functions. The allocation of attention, the capacity to experience positive and negative emotions, the regulation of stress, the ability to empathically and intuitively read the emotional states of other human beings, and indeed morality. This is all really important. I want you to have a look here. This is a little picture of a little baby that has this startled response. That we, often that we have come across in our practice. Sometimes this startled response represents or suggests that the child has experienced some abuse, some neglect. So the more understanding that we now have about normal development and attachment, the better our understanding about the other side, right? And of that. And in this case, with this little baby, we have a situation where a caregiver is unable to attune and to read the baby's mental state and to form these nonverbal bonds that we've been talking about, this of emotional communication, to help this infant regulate the poor little baby just looks like he's quite frightened. Studies have also shown that children exposed to maltreatment and family violence, neglect show the same patterns of heightened activation to those brains of soldiers exposed to violence, which is really interesting. I want to show you, everyone, this is actually part of a YouTube clip itself, and it's the still face experiment. And the reason why I want to show this video to you and include it as part of this training session, for the purposes for this training session, is for us to see how damaging it can be, and how distressing it can be for an infant to have a parent that is not engaging with them, that isn't having those beautiful interpersonal experiences, that we saw earlier on in those attunement photos between those caregivers and their infants. So we can see how this infant in this little clip is experiencing a lot of distress, and you can just imagine what life is like for a lot of our young people that we're seeing with complex trauma, who have probably many instances, if not from birth, have lacked those interactions with their caregivers, and how distressing it can be. And it can affect many people. It can affect people who have complex trauma backgrounds. It can affect people who have addictions, who have a postnatal disorders, postnatal depression, postnatal psychosis, have mental health issues as well. So it's really powerful. This is 2 minutes, so I want us to imagine what it is like then for so many of the kids that we see. When I read files of the trauma that a lot of these kids have experienced, it's severe trauma. It's just beyond some of the things that you can imagine a little tiny baby experiencing. I remember once reading about a little baby who, from the moment she was born, her mother said, I don't want her in this room, get her out. And every time she would cry, the nurses would come in and take the baby because the mum just couldn't and wouldn't attend to her. Other babies that have been left on their back for months and months and months, and when community services have finally taken that baby into care, the whole back of their head has been flat, and they're so delayed in their development, they can't hold their head up at 9 months. Lots of babies are crawling at that age, and this baby, it's just very telling of a lot of what these experiences have been, for a lot of these little babies. So back to this still face experiment. I did highlight earlier the importance of baby mum, the parent or carer infant exchanges, and the mother's emotional expressive face is by far the most potent visual stimulus in an infant's environment, and the child's intense interest in her face, especially her eyes, it gives him so much information about the world, social information, cognitive information, and it's very arousing. So it only lasts a few seconds, but the infant learns so much from it. And you can actually see infants and mums and their caregivers go from a neutral state to a state of joy and excitement within 3 seconds. It's just some amazing stuff. Deep joy, excitement, and laughing within 3 seconds, this interaction. So this communication that we see appears instantaneous, but a frame-by-frame analysis shows that it actually it's an organized dialogue occurring within milliseconds. Both partners at a moment-to-moment basis, at a level beneath awareness. So it's not like they're doing it on purpose or deliberately. It's just happening so naturally. They're able to match each other's state. And then they simultaneously adjust their social attention, the stimulating arousal, and they're responding to their partner's signals, to each other's signals. And this is called intuitive parenting. You ask the mother and she can't describe it. It's just happening so intuitively, so naturally. It's just beautiful. So let's have a look at this still face experiment and have a see the impact on this little infant, you know, when mum stops responding to her.
In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm my good girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
You know, that's actually a little bit distressing to watch, and I've seen it so many times, and sometimes when I play it in my face-to-face training sessions, people do start crying because it's very distressing. And so it's very powerful in helping us imagine what these very early experiences may have been like for a lot of these kids who actually present as very tall, very big, very aggressive. These kids were babies once. You know, we need to understand, how did these experiences impact the development? What world, like I said before, what world are they coming from? What does it tell us about what does the behavior now tell us about the world that they're coming from? What was it like for them? And how amazing it is, really, that they have survived. I want to show you some more clips. Again, this is again from YouTube. And I've just cut them into, you know, snippets. So these are, it's very old, so bear with the content because it's old. But I guess I just want to, the purpose of showing you these clips of this young girl is just to show, you know, the effect or the behaviors that we can sometimes see in a lot of these kids. That can be very challenging for us as clinicians to interpret, and also, you know, the level of neglect that a lot of these kids can experience. So this is Beth.
Are people afraid of you, Beth?
Uh-huh.
Who's afraid of you, Beth?
John.
Your brother. And what is your brother? Why is your brother afraid of you?
Because I hurt him so much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what are you trying to do to your brother?
Kill him.
Beth and Jonathan had severe emotional problems.
We had the kids with us, Beth and her younger brother John, for probably a couple of months until we began to learn something about their background and their past. And when we learned it, some things seemed to fall in place about her behavior and John's behavior. From several sources, we discovered that they didn't have enough food to eat. That perhaps even Beth went all day maybe with just a box of Kick cereal. John himself was found in a bassinet with little patches of urine all over it and a dirty diaper and a couple of bottles at his feet that had curdled milk, and the back of his head was completely flat. The front of his head had bulged out, and at 7 months he couldn't raise his head, couldn't roll over. He was just had no stimulation, and we think perhaps that had happened to Beth, and it wasn't very long until she began showing some signs of perhaps even some abuse. There was a nightmare that she had, and the nightmare was about a man who was falling on her and hurting her with a part of himself.
Tell me about your birth father. What was that nightmare like?
When he touched my vagina
Okay.
until it bled, hurt it a lot until it bled, and wouldn't feed me a lot. He'd hit on me, wouldn't be very nice to me. I get real scared.
Where are you in the nightmare? What happens in the dream?
I'm in the house, upstairs.
And then what happens, Beth?
When he comes upstairs and hurts.
How do you feel when you talk about this?
Scared.
Where's your birth father? What's he doing?
He's right there, and there's his hand. His hand's right there.
Where?
Right there. You can't hardly see it because it's green.
What's it touching?
My vagina.
And what is your birth father doing?
Hurting it.
Your face looks sad. Can you tell me about that?
It's crying because there's dots of the tears.
Beth had endured severe neglect and abuse as a child. Her birth mother died when she was 1. The early sexual abuse by her birth father would cause her to exhibit inappropriate sexual behavior, especially toward her brother.
Does your brother have private parts?
Yeah.
Yeah? What is his private parts?
Penis and butt.
And what do you do with your brother, with his private parts, Beth?
I heard it.
Tell me about it. What do you do?
Well, I pinch it, squeeze it, kick it.
When you do things to your brother's private parts, what does he say?
Stop.
Okay, tell me that.
Well, he says stop, but I don't stop.
Do you hurt him?
A lot.
Okay. And would you like to do that to other boys?
When I caught her with Jonathan one morning, she was molesting him. He was crying and his pants were down, and I said, Beth, what's happening? And she said, I pulled his penis and put my finger up his anus. And I said, didn't he say to stop? And she said, yeah, he did. And I said, did you? And she said, no. She started to masturbate at inappropriate times. I remember one time, specifically, when we were at the hospital waiting for Tim to come out. He was there visiting. And Beth and John were in the back seat, and I turned around, and she had her legs spread and was masturbating in a public parking lot.
The animals, Beth?
4 of them.
Can you tell me their names?
Clyde, Shuggy, Darcy, and Annie. And Daddy said
a day ago that there was a stray cat who did not have a home, so Daddy was taking care of it and took it to the vet when he had his flight to go.
And what do you do to the animals, Beth?
Stick them with pins.
Do you stick them a little bit or a lot?
A lot.
What are you trying to do to the animals, Beth?
Kill them.
What do they do when you stick them with the pins?
Well, Annie cries. She's a dog.
She got baby birds down out of the nest, and we thought maybe she was just curious. So we explained that she could hurt them, put them back, and went through a whole sitting down and talking to her about the problem of it. And the next day we went out to check the baby birds, and they were on the ground dead with their necks broken.
The repercussions of Beth's tragic childhood led to uncontrollable rage. Despite the love and nurturing of her adoptive parents, she took this rage out on herself, on her brother, and on them. Her acts of violence became more and more cruel and frightening.
Okay, so even though the behaviors of young people with relational trauma backgrounds may seem chaotic and crazy, so much of it is explained by neuroscience. We can understand self-regulation and attempts at self-regulation when we understand neuroscience. Sometimes these attempts at self-regulation are masked by intense aggression and rejection, when in reality the fundamental function of that aggression and rejection is to regulate affect. Our survival, our relationships, our mental health, so much of our lives depend on our ability to modulate our own arousal. There is a massive reorganization of the brain in adolescence, and amazingly it includes the reorganization of the same circuits of the right brain. And so during this time, there is this exquisite vulnerability to the individual, and that's why we see a lot of disorders emerging and the need for self-regulation in adolescence again. But the sad news, the bad news is that this time, young people have access to things that, to high risk behaviors, such as, drug taking, sex, criminal activity. They are now able to regulate or to impact their own internal states through risky behaviors. We as clinicians understand what prosocial self-regulation involves: seeking comfort from attachment figures, talking about emotions, reinterpreting meaning, and even self-injurious, self-regulating behaviors, self-harm, at-risk behavior, playing with weapons. We get that really well, but maybe, and a lot of us might not see antisocial behavior as ways of or attempts at self-regulation. And I mean, that might be because there's a different focus. The focus is not on the self, so it's as in self-harm, focus is in the community or people around you. So maybe I don't know, I guess it's not as common for us in the community to understand those behaviors as attempts at self-regulation. When dysregulated, our young people may seek to re-regulate. So like I said before, to regain self-efficacy and control over themselves, to contain affect within a tolerable range. And this can happen in three ways. So when we talk about the prosocial, it's really about, efforts at self-regulating that we would learn in therapy. Talk about your emotions, challenging your thoughts, writing things in a journal, behavioral interventions, activities, positive activities, exercise, all the stuff, artistic expression. Self-injurious, as I said before, these behaviors provide a sense of relief, a restoration of sense of self. I guess it's temporary, And it really does lead to further dysregulation and then this cycle of self-destructive behaviors, even like some eating disorders, you know, are self-injurious attempts at self-regulation. We could say we're seeing actually a lot more of that in our young people. But it is these antisocial ways of self-regulating, which are efforts at self-regulation that are antisocial in nature, and include the destruction of property, you know, bullying, physical aggression, sexualized, you know, acting in sexually inappropriate ways. These things can provide some temporary relief from the subjective distress of being dysregulated. Stealing, you know, oppositional behaviors, but aggression in particular, you know, we were born as humans, we were born as aggressive, with the ability to be very, very aggressive, but we've been socialized away from aggression, right? It is through parental socialization that we have learned not to be aggressive. But by nature, humans can be we're animals, we can be very aggressive, but we've been taught to share, we've been taught to be nice. Well, at least those of us that have been born into those home environments have been socialized out of being aggressive. We can be very violent. So in terms of our interventions with a lot of these young people, we really want to aim to reduce this arousal. That is a big goal of all of our interventions, to soothe the animal brain, to speak to the part of the brain activated when the brain is severely traumatized. So when a young person better tolerates arousal, it means that they are not as easily activated into that animal zone anymore. They have developed the reserve in their nervous system to tolerate it better. They are better able to tolerate stress. And you know what? Relationships heal. Studies of major traumas have shown that those who isolate themselves after a trauma don't heal, and those who engage in their communities do. Our relationships are critical in the healing process, and being able to attune to the wavelength is important. To speak the same language is important. I want to show you on that note of self-regulation, I want to show you a little clip of a girl and her explanation as to what works for her for self-regulating. And she's an adolescent. She's a troubled young girl who does engage in drug use and also self-harm. So she's part antisocial, so the drug use, but I guess in a way that she's doing it to herself and self-interest behavior. And I'm going to show you another video of another young person, a young man who self-regulates in a different way. But just on the note of self-regulation, of self-regulation and self-injurious behaviors, parental deprivation is highly associated with self-injurious behaviors in humans and even in animals. And there are studies, for example, monkeys that are raised in isolation, so away from their parents, and they tend to display sucking and chewing behaviors for long after typically developmentally appropriate, more so than the non-isolated counterparts. And these isolated little monkeys were also equally likely to respond to external threat with self-directed aggression as with outward aggression, whereas the monkeys that were not raised in isolation were less likely to respond with self or other directed aggression when placed under stress. In humans, what we know is that parental deprivation is a key predictor of self-injurious behavior, and it is thought that the lack of self-regulation learned in early mother-infant relationships may be the mediating factor. So it's up to 79% of people who self-injure report a history of abuse and neglect. And whilst physical abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse are all strong predictors of later self-injurious behavior, it's actually sexual abuse that has that is the biggest predictor. And if sexual abuse is conducted by the perpetrator is within the victim's family, then it's a stronger predictor, but it is the strongest predictor of self-injurious behavior if the sexual abuse is perpetrated by a parent. So that is the biggest predictor of self-injurious behavior. Now, just before I show you this video, as well as the one after, I want you to just imagine and just remember a time in your life that was really, really difficult for you. Maybe it was, and I want you to think of a major event, because remember we said these kids go through major events. They go through big life stresses. So just, I mean, you know, worrying that siblings are at home, or worrying that your parent might wake up dead of an overdose, or not knowing who's going to come and look after you, or, you know, what placement you're going to go to next. They're also very vulnerable on the street, if they're homeless. So I want you to just imagine or remember actually a time that was extremely stressful for you, a time that was really, really difficult for you. And I want you to imagine that you don't have the social support that you have at the moment. I want you to imagine that you don't have the, I guess, you know, the skills that you have at coping yourself, the cognitive skills, the capacity to self-regulate the way that you do. I mean, most of you, you know, who are watching these are probably the ones who are in a position of care. So whether, you know, medical, nursing, allied health, carer, caseworker, so you're all educated, you know, you have some reserve in your nervous system and your brain to contain levels of arousal. So just imagine that that's all out the door, and that you're also much younger. Remember, when we're much younger, our emotions seem to feel seem quite magnified, and you have this major, you're experiencing this major stressor, and you're waking up every morning with that feeling in your chest, with that feeling in your throat, and you're just hating the day, and you wake up that way day after day after day with that pain, that fear, right? And someone says, here, take this, it's gonna go away. You can wake up and not feel that. Or someone says, hey, why don't you try doing this? It's going to go away. You're not going to feel that anymore. So it really becomes nectar of the gods, because it takes all of that away. We would do anything to feel better. Anything if we don't have to live with that emotional torment. It's really hard. When arousal is overwhelming, these kids avoid feeling that way as much as they can. We would as well. If they're afraid of those feelings, of that arousal, they stay afraid, and then they want to numb. And they do so with marijuana, they do so with alcohol, with cutting, with sex. And so what do these things become for them? Nectar of the gods, because it takes them out of that place that they are so scared of. We need to teach them adaptive ways of modulating the arousal. We need to teach them to manage the arousal. But we can see how it really, you know, it's really hard. So anyway, it's just for us to understand, you know, why do these kids do a lot of these things? Well, there's a lot of arousal there that we're asking. They're very chaotic and fragile nervous systems to sustain, and sometimes they do what they have to do to survive. Let's have a look at this first clip.
This is 13-year-old Gabby from Catherine in the Territory. She's a suspected self-harmer whose antisocial behaviour has her banned from every school in the region.
I did speed and ice. And you just call the drug dealer up and ask to get some stuff, and then my friend buys it all, and then I go to their house and smoke a big bag of weed.
It kills me inside when I have to look at my arms when they're like this, but it makes me feel that much better. it just takes my pain. Like, there's not, like, none of my issues are that big when I look at my arms. But
this next little video is about a young boy who is very distressed, and he is showing that distress with some aggression. So he is trying to regulate affect associated with the rejection of his mother. His mother doesn't want to see him. Now, this is very painful. This is extremely painful. Just imagine a parent not wanting to see you. You know, in private practice, I remember seeing a 60-year-old woman, an older woman, and she was crying in front of me, saying all I ever wanted was my mother to think I was good enough. And that was heartbreaking. You know, this parental rejection is incredibly powerful, no matter how old you are, and it stays with you. So here we have a boy whose mother is not ready to see him for whatever reason. Remember, we talked about again that, you know, this attunement, this connection between mother and child is very strong. It is, you know, it is a law. So it takes a lot to derail that. So something's going on here with mum, clearly. But let's have a look and see how this boy copes with it. And the beautiful thing about this video is how the relationship with one of his carers towards the end, you can already see can be so healing. It's really quite beautiful what happens in the end.
Let me go.
Please, just sit here, please.
Just sit. Let me go now.
No, just sit here, please.
Let me go now.
Lee's mum is still refusing to see him, and Lee only knows one way to express his anguish.
Fuck you! What's wrong with you?
You need to stop exploding, alright, Lee? It's up to you what choice you make, man. You understand? Alright. Please.
Bit better.
When you look at that when you're pissed off, look who's in that photo. If you do something stupid and go to prison, that's the only way you're going to see me through a photo. Do you understand? Alright. Alright, come on.
So we're nearly at the end. The main points for today's training session is understanding how it is that the attachment relationship impacts a child's ability to self-regulate. The first 3 years of life of brain development are entirely dedicated to the development of emotion regulation, to the development of relationships. And so the attachment relationship, for good or bad, will impact the maturation of the areas in the brain that underpin emotion regulation. And so what we find in a lot of our young people who have experienced complex trauma is that they have an incapacity to regulate the physiological basis for prosocial behavior. That is really important for us to remember. We've also thrown around the concept of external co-regulation of affect, and this is important and is relevant for the cohort of young people that we're talking about, that are the subject of this training session. And that is because it is through the external co-regulation of behavior and within a relationship that we are able to help these young people develop some of that reserve in the nervous system to regulate increasing levels of affect. We know why emotion regulation is so important. We need it in everyday life, and so the stresses of these young kids are even greater than some of the things that we're experiencing in everyday life. So the way in which they try to self-regulate that level of arousal can be quite dysfunctioning. Very few engage in prosocial ways of self-regulation. Many of them engage in self-injurious ways of self-regulation, as well as some antisocial ways of self-regulation. And now that we understand neuroscience a little bit more, we understand that a lot of these behaviors can often mask a lot of that dysregulation. It's important to also remember that the part of the brain that is activated when the brain is traumatized is the brainstem. And the biggest mistake that we can make as clinicians or anyone trying to connect with these young people, is to talk to a different part of the brain. So often we talk to the part of the brain that is activated in us, so our thinking brains, and we try to talk to the thinking brain of that young person, and that's where we lose young people. That's when we lose connecting and engaging with young people, because what we're actually doing is we're creating arousal that the animal brain just doesn't know how to contain. I've left it at that, but our next session is actually going to talk about how it is that we do that. So thank you for listening and for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. There is more to come. See you soon.